Hello, my name is David Starkey, and this is the first video of my new YouTube channel called David Starkey Talks. Talking, David Starkey, talking, well, what? About history. Well, David Starkey got into those two things, talking and history, at different times, and I suppose for different reasons. But let's just look at them. It won't surprise you, I imagine, bearing in mind my reputation, my mother's wonderful comment, "Your tongue will be the ruin of me." She was, of course, right and wrong. It both made, and some would say, unmade and undid me. But I was an incredibly verbal child. Why? Well, I was an only child. I was brought up essentially with adults rather than with other children. My parents were already quite old for the time. They were 38. And for the first 4 or 5 years of my life, that crucial period, my grandfather, who was then in his late 60s, lived with us as well. Though an adult world. But it was also an adult world that was very verbal itself, because each one of those three people, my grandfather, my mother, and my father, had wildly different political and social opinions. My father, well, it's odd to think I'm his son, but he was far left Labour Party. If Jeremy Corbyn had been alive, he'd have been a Corbynista at that point. He supported the man who was in fact the direct ancestor of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, a man called Lansbury, George Lansbury, who was pacifist and thought the British Empire was terrible, and all the usual Corbynista things. My father was also a pacifist for another reason. He was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, and he was a radical and advanced trade unionist, all of those things. My grandfather was just about the polar opposite of all of those. My father, left-wing, pacifist, trade unionist, Labour Party candidate, all sorts of things. My grandfather was solid, working-class Tory. He had voted for Churchill in the seat that Churchill first wins when he becomes a parliamentarian, way back at the very beginning of the 20th century in Oldham. Not only that, although he was in his 30s by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he still volunteered, and he had 3 children. He didn't fight at the front. He was a driver to the top brass in London. So he was Tory, a passionate patriot, and absolutely not a trace of pacifism. I remember vividly the only time I ever got in a fight was a result of my grandfather. I can even remember the person the fight was with, called David Holmes, and he had been picking on me after I'd been bought a new tricycle. And I went home and moaned and cried about it, and my grandfather said, "Well, do something about it," to the absolute horror of my mother, who was almost as pacifist as my father. But I'm afraid I took my grandfather's advice and went out and pasted him and had to be pulled off, which is very shameful. So, and then my mother, between the working class Tory and the extreme radical pacifist Labour supporting father, my mother was a liberal. So I was brought up in this world of talk, of debate. And there was another thing too, not a human being, or at least not directly a human being, but the presence of what in those days was called the wireless. And it was a big Morphy Richards set in a kind of mock tortoiseshell plastic with a kind of very curvy, and this is late Art Deco, with the loudspeaker covered in a golden fabric. And of course, these were the days when the BBC was the BBC, which is why I talk as I do. As one boyfriend, and I won't actually quote the exact phrase, said, "You sound like a Duchess." That's why that happened. So a world of talk and debate. A world in which I became precociously eloquent. There was a wonderful moment, the story is sort of engraved in my mind, when I was about 3, and we encountered a woman when we were out shopping on a very narrow bridge called Stramongate Bridge, and the woman did the usual sort of goody goody goo, and what did the little man do today? And the little man looked at her and said, I helped my mother make a steak and kidney pudding. These are the quantities. This is how you weigh them out. These are the kind of scales we've got, in which the big weights are in cast iron and the small weights are in copper, and how you make it is this, and how you put it in the basin is that. And of course the woman's jaws opened further and further and further, and she apparently never forgot the story. So this incredible verbalism. When I was at school, I was very fortunate, both at primary school and then more specifically at grammar school. There was a tradition of public speaking. It was the only time I was ever popular, because I always won the public speaking competition for my house and for drama. So a culture of words, of conflict, debate, of argument, of the ability really to say anything and not too many hard feelings, perhaps a bit different from our own time. History comes very much later. Well, there are anticipations of it earlier on, but it's a very peculiar kind of history. It was when I was at primary school. I was very interested in buildings, in architecture, in old things. I was even sort of collecting antiques when I was 8 or 9, and I have a school prize that was given to me in 1955 when I'm 10, which is the Observer's Book of British Architecture. And then the following year, in 1956, decisive moment, I won the top prize at my primary school. I still have it. It's the 4 volumes of the Quinnell's History of Everyday Things in England. This is a history of England from the Norman conquest to what was then the Second World War, told not in terms of kings and queens, as you might expect from me, not in terms of the history of Parliament or freedoms or anything, or political parties or trade unions, but it's told in terms of things, objects, dress, china, silver, pewter, buildings, their wainscoting, their panelling, their doors, their floorboards, their windows, their shutters. Do they have slate roofs? Everything in Kendal had a slate roof and was built of limestone. Elsewhere in England, it's wattle and daub and half-timbered and thatch. It was an astonishing approach. And of course, modern scholarship has caught up with that and the things and how called material culture. But that was... And the impact of that colours everything that I feel and think about history. If you approach history through things, what you do immediately, you realise that the people who inhabited those rooms, who used that pewter and silver, who wore those clothes, who walked on those floorboards, you realise they're real. They're three-dimensional. They're not just actors proclaiming lines. They're not just figures embodying, the abstract ideas of Marxism or socialism or conservatism. They're real people, and they challenge you to engage with them as real people. But do you know what? I had none of that at school. None of it at all. The teaching of history in my first years at grammar school was awful. It was just a dreary recitation of notes, and I wasn't remotely interested in it. The subjects that enthused me, that I got seriously committed to, were, again, sorry, this is Cambridge language, were the natural sciences, physics and chemistry. I loved the fact that they were rooted in, they were rooted in facts. They were rooted in observation. They were rooted in experiment and the analysis of those experiments and the ability to repeat those experiments. And so I did very well in these subjects. I did pretty well. Let's boast. I did 13 O-levels or whatever it was. I did very well in all of them, but especially in physics and chemistry. And I can still remember my chemistry master, Mr. Morton, saying to me, "Come on," who you'll call by your surname in those days. "Come on, Starkey. Think. You can think, boy. If you do physics and chemistry, in your spare time, you can read nice things like history." I was planning to do for my A-levels. You can read history, and you can read French, and you can read English literature. But if you just do history, French, English literature. You can't keep up with the natural sciences. Well, he was right and he was wrong, because I had the great good luck to realise I couldn't be a good scientist because I wasn't a natural mathematician. And I was very fortunate that in my class in the grammar school there were two extraordinary natural mathematicians. They could hear numbers, see numbers, breathe numbers. They had colour, shape, form. That was never true for me, and both of them went on to impressive scientific careers. But for me, going back to talking, it was words. Words spoke to me. Words were the vehicle through which I explored and encountered history. So why history after all that? Well, I suppose really almost by default, as my conversation with Mr. Morton makes clear, I had decided that I was going to do arts in the sixth form, history, English, French. Again, defying rules. I should have done Latin, but I didn't much like it, and it was foolish, but there we are. But why the concentration on history? I suppose it was, and I can still remember debating with those mathematician friends who went on and did the sciences about facts. It's because history is the art subject which really is nearest to one of those sciences, because finally it deals in fact. Now, this is a very unfashionable word, and now a very unfashionable idea, and even more fashionable if I link the idea to truth. I believe that history is actually a quest for fact and a quest for truth. That is the quest for evidence. Arguments in history are, of course, arguments. They're subjects of debate and interpretation. But the events themselves, the evidence itself, is fact. It's as much a fact that Henry VIII is born on the 22nd of April 1509, that there's a supernova, that there's anything that is measurable astronomically. And in fact, historical facts and astronomical facts are very similar because they both take place in the past. Remember, every one of our observations of the sky is a historical observation because of the time that light takes to travel the extraordinary number of millions of miles away to us. They're historical observations in the same way that the evidence of the past is a survival of that past. But for me, it was the discovery of the quest for evidence, the interrogation of evidence. That word, interrogation. I hope there's a slight shiver at that word, a certain sense of a secret policeman, and with perhaps some unpleasant instrument lying in a corner of the room. Because the whole way in which science and history have advanced in this extraordinary period, in the last 500 years of our history, since the 15th century, is as a quest for fact and for truth, the interrogation of evidence, the interrogation of nature. And the great proto-scientist Francis Bacon has a wonderful phrase. He describes the process of experiment, which is analogous, which is the parallel to the testing of historical evidence. He describes it, again a slight shudder I hope here, as putting nature to the question. Now in modern English that sounds A, a bit obscure, and B, pretty harmless. But remember, question, la question, is the French for torture. Because under French traditional law, torture was used so frequently that the judge simply listed the method of questioning in the margin with 1, 2, and 3. That was the number of wedges that were driven into the movable plank that was placed along the fixed plank with your legs sandwiched in the middle. So 1 was significant pressure, 2 probably burst blood vessels, and 3 shattered bones. So that's like the question. That's putting nature to the test, to the torture. And that's what the historian does with historical evidence in this quest for this thing called truth. Now, I briefly glimpsed this. I glimpsed it very briefly as a sixth former. I had the great good fortune to have a history master at this point who, having been terrible lower down the school, became very good, not as a teacher, but as an enabler. he did something remarkable. He gave me the run of his library. For a boy, we had books in the house, unusual numbers of books, but perhaps a dozen, 20, 30, 40. Suddenly to be in a room like this that was lined with bookshelves, with hundreds and hundreds of books, the opportunity of reading them. So I read avidly. Now this also had a downside, because when I went to Cambridge, I'd actually read everything I was supposed to read. I remember a terrible experience in my first supervision. At the end of it, my supervisor, she's going to remain nameless because it was a shameful thing to say. You can imagine me, a bumptious 19-year-old. She said to me, "You know more about this than I do." Terrible, terrible. I was bored for my first 2 years. In some ways, I wasted them. I didn't do my work as regularly as I should have done. I read vastly, but I didn't perform as well as I should have done. In my third year, on the other hand, I had the enormous good fortune to do what was called a special subject, which was a mixture of usual interpretation, historical interpretation, but also the use of actual sources, and to do it supervised by, it wasn't yet Sir Geoffrey Elton, but by Professor Geoffrey Elton. And there came an extraordinary moment. We had to look at documents. We had to say what sort of document it was. Was it a royal proclamation? Was it a signet letter? How was it written? Was it printed? Whatever it was. And Geoffrey, of course, had headed the documents. And there came an extraordinary moment when me, as a third-year undergraduate, what was I, 20, 21, put up my hand and said to Elton, "I think you're wrong. This isn't," I can't remember now, "this isn't a circular letter, this is a proclamation. It's a proclamation rather than a circular letter," because I had actually looked at the form of the document and I'd worked out what it was. And Elton, of course, and then, "You're right." And I'd learned I could do it. I'd learned I could debate and win with the sharpest historical mind in Cambridge. Do you know what? I was hooked. But this is only the foundation of history. This is the vital point. The quest for truth. The truth on which all progress, all improvement, all self-improvement is based. And history done properly has that as its foundation. But do you know what? It's only its foundation. And I made it sound awfully serious. Well, it is serious, but, we as human beings are both very serious and we're very silly. Often what we do, I know, I speak from experience, is very silly. And history is this extraordinary mixture of this quest, this serious quest for truth, and the observation of the essential absurdity and smileability of human experience. I mean, how could you invent, this is history, if you like, a soap opera. I mean, how could you invent the story of Henry VIII? I mean, the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives goes beyond fiction. Henry is a vastly more interesting figure than mythological figures like Bluebeard. Hugely more interesting. Mary Tudor, is much more interesting than the Greek myth figure of Medea. Elizabeth knocks a Virgin Mary into a cocked hat. The Tudors are both real and mythic. And history has this extraordinary quality of, yes, soap opera, but also the demand for you to use imagination and human sympathy. This is why I despair at those moaning, "Oh, people in the past didn't have our values." Surely, history is the ultimate form of tourism. It's the quest for different experiences, for different ways of being human, for the ability to understand that societies can be organised in different ways and according to different values. So it's the recognition of the wonderful variety and difference of human experience and the value that has. And as I said, the extraordinary mixture of happiness and laughter and tears and distress and horror. It's extraordinary. The sheer emotional quality of history. Well, that's one thing. Truth, encounter with the variety of humanity. But there's something, dare I say, even more fundamental than truth, even more fundamental than the willing engagement with difference and variety. And it is, and here I suppose it's the great English both politician and philosopher Edmund Burke who's shaped my thoughts more than anybody else. History really is. I mean, people. There's that corny phrase. If you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat its mistakes. Well, sort of. But it's more fundamental than that. We are grounded, rooted in history. Look at that word. Those two words actually, grounded and rooted. What do they suggest? Well, they suggest something. And here, of course, I'm an old man. And what do old men do? They get into gardening. It suggests an idea of gardening. The roots are in the ground, and they are fertilized by what? They're fertilized by dead vegetation. That process of making compost takes the growth of one year and rots it and turns it into the compost, into the humus from which the wonderful green growth of another year comes. And you know what? We and our societies are like that. We don't invent ourselves. We don't create ourselves. We don't come into the world with free will. Never has there been a sillier phrase than Rousseau. Rousseau's French, and all bad ideas are French. Than Rousseau's that famous opening phrase, man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains. Man, and dare I say it, even women, are not born free. We are born, in that wonderful phrase of St. Augustine, in the middle of piss and shit. We are helpless, naked, filthy. We depend on a mother. We depend on parenthood. We depend on somebody to nurture us, nurses and cleaners. We are helpless. We are creatures of circumstance. We are a product of the historical situation into which we are born. Our ideas, our values, everything is given to us by the past. Now, very important though, this does not make me a determinist. This does not mean that I am a rigid conservative. I believe something else. I believe that there is a creative, this is Burke, a creative relationship between past and present and future. And it's put most brilliantly by a figure who comes from the very early days of English. Remember, English is a very modern language. It's only about 600 years old, and it's founded to an extraordinary extent by one man, by Geoffrey Chaucer, in the late 14th century. And Chaucer is a great phrase maker. He's, of course, at a collision of cultures, of Latin, Italian, English, French, and he making of all those a new reformed literary English. Before then, English is just peasant patois, it's a grunt. And Chaucer has this marvellous phrase that it's his relationship of old and new. Old books. This is what the Renaissance is, the rediscovery of the ancient world, the old books of Greek and Latin. Old books from which new learning springs. So the new comes from the old. And this, I think, is what the proper task of the historian is. You are a vehicle. You're a kind of interpreter between past and present. And if, like one of the greatest interpreters of the past, like Churchill, who is both practicing politician and supreme historian, you study the past to enable you to understand the present and to shape the future.